Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin the first story. Jake Henderson had been driving trucks for 25 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the road could throw at him. Snowstorms in Colorado, flash floods in Texas, and more close calls than he cared to remember. But nothing had prepared him for that night on Highway 59, through what the other truckers called the dead stretch. It was a 50-mile section of road that cut through the deep woods of East Texas. The asphalt was old and cracked, and the trees grew so thick on either side that even during the day, the canopy blocked out most of the sunlight. At night, it was like driving through a tunnel of darkness. Jake had picked up a load in Laredo, bound for Memphis. The quickest route took him right through the dead stretch. And despite the stories he'd heard, he wasn't about to add extra hours to his trip just to avoid some local legend. Ghost stories were for campfires and late-night radio shows, not for practical men with bills to pay. As midnight approached, Jake felt the familiar weight of fatigue settling on his shoulders. He'd been driving for 8 hours straight, sustained by truck stop, coffee, and classic rock on the radio. But as he entered the dead stretch, his radio crackled with static and then went silent. Complete dead air. The silence was unsettling. Even his engine seemed quieter here, as if the forest was absorbing sound itself. The trees pressed close to the road, their branches forming twisted shapes in his headlights. There was no moon visible through the thick canopy, and the darkness felt heavier than usual. Jake reached for his thermos of coffee, needing the familiar comfort of caffeine. As he unscrewed the cap, something moved in his peripheral vision. A shape, too quick to identify, darted across the road about 50 yards ahead. Jake's hands jerked on the wheel, and the truck swerved slightly before he corrected it. Just a deer, he muttered to himself, though something about the movement had seemed wrong. Too upright, too purposeful. He shook his head and took a long sip of coffee, willing himself to focus on the road ahead. For the next few miles, everything was quiet. The steady rhythm of his tires on the cracked asphalt began to lull him back into the meditative state that came with long-distance driving. But then his temperature gauge spiked into the red, and a warning light began blinking on his dashboard. Jake cursed under his breath. Engine trouble was the last thing he needed, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. He pulled over to the shoulder, the big rig groaning to a halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him surrounded by absolute silence. He sat for a moment, listening to the quiet, no crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jake grabbed his CB radio and tried to raise anyone on the channel. Breaker 19, this is Big Jake. Anyone out there? Static answered him. Come on, someone's got to be out here. More static, and then, faintly, something that might have been a voice. Jake strained to hear, adjusting the volume and squelch, but the sound faded away. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The air was thick and still, carrying the earthy smell of decomposing leaves and old wood. Jake walked around to the front of his truck and popped the hood, shining his light over the engine. Everything looked normal. The radiator wasn't leaking, the belts were intact, and there were no obvious problems. As he stood there, puzzling over the mysterious engine failure, Jake heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind through leaves, but as he listened, it resolved into something that sounded almost like a voice calling his name. Jake turned slowly, sweeping his flashlight across the tree line. The beam caught something pale, about 30 yards into the woods. It looked like a piece of cloth, maybe a shirt, hanging from a low branch. But as Jake focused his light on it, he realized it wasn't cloth at all. It was a person, suspended from the branch by a rope around their neck. The body swayed gently in a breeze that Jake couldn't feel, turning slowly, as if to show him different angles of their face. The features were indistinct in the flashlight beam, but there was something familiar about the build, the way the hair fell across the forehead. Jake stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked away and then back, sure that his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But the figure was still there, still swaying, still watching him with empty eye sockets. Without another thought, Jake bolted for his truck. He threw himself into the driver's seat and turned the key, praying that the engine would start. It roared to life immediately, as if there had never been a problem at all. Jake threw it into gear and floored the accelerator, not caring about speed limits or safety regulations. As his truck pulled away from the shoulder, Jake glanced in his rearview mirror. The hanging figure was gone, but in its place stood something else, a tall, thin shape at the edge of his taillight's glow, watching him drive away. Jake didn't slow down until he was through the dead stretch and back in civilization. He never took that route again, and whenever other truckers asked him about it, he would just shake his head and suggest they find another way to Memphis. Some roads, he learned, are better left to the dead. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. The fog had been getting thicker for the last 30 miles, and Jake Owens was starting to regret not pulling over at the last truck stop. Interstate 44 through Missouri could be tricky in good weather, but in fog like this, it was downright dangerous. The white mist rolled across the highway in waves, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet on a good stretch. Jake had been driving for 18 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. Tonight, those instincts were telling him something was wrong. It wasn't just the fog, though that was part of it. There was something else, a feeling that had been growing stronger with each mile, the feeling of being watched. He'd heard the stories, of course. Every trucker had tales of ghostly hitchhikers, phantom vehicles, and strange figures that appeared along the highway in the dead of night. Jake had always filed those stories under entertainment, something to pass the time during long hauls. But tonight, alone in the fog, with nothing but the sound of his engine for company, those stories didn't seem quite so far-fetched. The first sign of trouble came from his CB radio. Jake hadn't touched the thing in hours, but suddenly it crackled to life with a burst of static. Through the white noise came a voice, faint but distinct. "Breaker 19, you there?" Jake leaned forward and grabbed the microphone. "Yeah, this is Jake. Who's out there?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, the voice came again, clearer this time, but somehow hollow, as if it were echoing from a great distance. "Watch out for him." The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. He keyed the microphone again, his voice slightly shaky. "Watch out for who? What are you talking about?" But there was no answer, just dead air and the steady hiss of static. Jake set the microphone down, his pulse quickening. Someone was playing games, he told himself. Probably some kid with a CB radio trying to spook the truckers. The fog continued to thicken, and Jake slowed his rig to a crawl. His headlights seemed to be swallowed by the white mist, barely illuminating the road ahead. He could see the yellow line marking the center of the highway, and he used it as his guide, staying carefully in his lane. That's when he saw the figure. It was standing on the side of the road, just visible through the fog. A man in a long dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, perfectly still, facing the highway. Jake slowed even more, squinting through the windshield to get a better look. The figure didn't move, didn't raise a thumb like a hitchhiker would. He just stood there, watching as Jake's truck approached. As Jake drew alongside the figure, he could see more details. The man's face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but there was something unsettling about his posture, the way he held himself so perfectly still. Jake felt compelled to roll down his window and call out, "You all right out there?" No response. The man didn't even turn his head. Jake pressed on, glancing in his rear-view mirror as he passed. In the red glow of his taillights, he could see the figure for a moment longer, still standing motionless by the roadside. Then the fog closed in, and the man disappeared from view. 20 minutes later, Jake pulled into a truck stop, needing a break from the oppressive fog and the strange encounter. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of other rigs parked under the dim lights. Jake climbed down from his cab and walked inside, where a fluorescent-lit diner offered the comfort of normal, everyday life. He ordered coffee and sat at the counter, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed his expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a smile. Jake forced a laugh. Long night. An old trucker, sitting a few stools down, looked up from his coffee. "You been driving the fog road?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, visibility's terrible out there." The old man's expression grew serious. "You see anything strange? Anyone walking around where they shouldn't be?" Jake hesitated, then described the figure in the hat. The old man's face went pale. "You saw him," the old man whispered. "The man in the hat. Drivers have been seeing him for years, always in the fog, always watching. They say if you pick him up," the old man trailed off, shaking his head. "What happens if you pick him up?" Jake asked, despite himself. "They say he takes you with him. Wherever it is, he goes, and you never come back." Jake finished his coffee quickly and left, not wanting to hear any more. But as he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the old man's words. The fog had lifted slightly, and visibility was better as he pulled back onto the highway. For a while, everything seemed normal. Jake drove through the night, making good time as the fog continued to thin. But then, just as dawn was beginning to break on the horizon, he saw the figure again. This time, the man in the hat was standing directly in the middle of the road. Jake hit the brakes, his truck skidding as he tried to stop. The figure stood perfectly still, not moving as the massive vehicle bore down on him. At the last second, Jake swerved, feeling the truck lean dangerously as he fought to maintain control. When he finally brought the rig to a stop, Jake sat there for a moment, his heart pounding. He looked in his mirrors, expecting to see the figure somewhere behind him, but the road was empty. Then he heard a voice, calm and hollow, coming from the passenger seat beside him. "I told you to watch out for him." Jake turned slowly, his blood turning to ice. The man in the hat was sitting beside him, smiling beneath the shadow of his brim. Jake never finished that run. His truck was found the next morning, empty and idling on the shoulder of I-44. There was no sign of Jake Owens, and no explanation for what had happened to him. But truckers still report seeing the man in the hat, standing in the fog, waiting patiently for the next driver who might be curious enough to stop. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Nate Collins had always prided himself on being a practical man. In 15 years of long-haul trucking, he'd seen plenty of things that might spook a lesser man. But Nate had explanations for everything. Strange lights in the sky were weather balloons or aircraft. Weird sounds on the CB radio were atmospheric interference. And the occasional glimpse of something moving in his peripheral vision was nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on his eyes. But the feeling that had been growing stronger over the past week was harder to explain away. It had started in Utah, on a lonely stretch of highway where the mountains loomed like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. Nate had been driving through the night, making good time on a delivery to Reno, when his CB radio had crackled to life. The voice that came through the static was barely a whisper, almost lost in the white noise. "Turn back." Nate had tried to respond, asking who was on the channel, but the voice didn't come again. Just those two words, spoken with such quiet urgency that they seemed to bypass his rational mind and go straight to some primitive part of his brain that still remembered what it meant to be prey. Since then, the feeling of being watched had grown stronger with each passing night. Nate found himself checking his mirrors more often, scanning the darkness beyond his headlights for shapes that shouldn't be there. He told himself it was just stress, the accumulated weight of too many years on the road and too little sleep. But deep down, he knew something was following him. Tonight, as he guided his 18-wheeler through the fog-shrouded hills of northern Nevada, that presence felt closer than ever. The mist had rolled in thick and heavy, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Nate had slowed to a crawl, following the yellow center line and hoping no one would come barreling up behind him in the whiteout conditions. The radio was silent except for the occasional burst of static. Even the distant chatter of other truckers, which usually provided some comfort during the long, lonely hours, was absent tonight. It was as if he were the only person left in the world, driving through an endless tunnel of fog. That's when he saw the lights ahead. At first, Nate thought it might be another truck, maybe pulled over on the shoulder with its hazards blinking. But as he drew closer, he realized the lights were wrong. They flickered and moved in a way that no vehicle lights should, dancing through the fog like willow, the wisps leading travelers astray. As he passed the spot where the lights had been, Nate glanced to his right and saw the outline of an old gas station. The building looked abandoned, its windows dark and its paint peeling, but a single light flickered above the entrance, casting weak, intermittent illumination over the empty lot. Nate's fuel gauge was running low, and he hadn't seen another station in over 50 miles. Against his better judgment, he pulled off the highway and into the station's lot. The gravel crunched under his tires as he brought the big rig to a stop near the pumps. As soon as he turned off the engine, the silence was overwhelming. No traffic sounds, no wind, nothing but the occasional ping of cooling metal from his truck's engine. Nate climbed down from the cab, the fog swirling around him like ghostly fingers. The pumps were old, the kind he remembered from his childhood. There were no digital displays, no credit card readers, just mechanical dials and lever handles that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. Nate tried one of the handles, but nothing happened. The pumps were dead. He was about to get back in his truck when he heard a sound that made his skin crawl. It was the slow creak of a door opening, coming from the direction of the station building. Nate turned and saw that the front door was standing ajar, swaying slightly in a breeze he couldn't feel. Every instinct told him to get back in his truck and drive away, but something compelled him to investigate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the trucker's code that said, "You always helped a fellow traveler in distress." Whatever it was, Nate found himself walking toward the open door. The building's interior was dark, except for the weak light filtering in from outside. Nate pulled out his phone and activated its flashlight, sweeping the beam across empty shelves covered in dust and debris. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and his footsteps echoed in the empty space. In the far corner of the store, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and where its face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. Nate stumbled backward, his phone's light flickering erratically. The figure took a step forward, moving with deliberate, predatory grace. Its movements were wrong, as if it were a marionette being operated by someone who had never seen a human walk. From outside, Nate's CB radio crackled to life, the same whispered voice he'd heard in Utah. "Turn back, turn back." Nate ran. He crashed through the doorway and sprinted across the gravel lot, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he could hear footsteps, slow and measured, but somehow keeping pace with his frantic flight. He threw himself into his truck and turned the key, flooding with relief when the engine roared to life. As he tore out of the lot and back onto the highway, Nate glanced in his rearview mirror. The figure stood in the middle of the road behind him, perfectly still, watching him flee. But even at highway speed, it seemed to be getting closer. For the next hour, Nate drove as fast as the fog would allow, his speedometer needle hovering near the red line. But no matter how fast he went, he could see the figure in his mirrors, always just at the edge of his light's reach, gliding along the asphalt with impossible speed. The voice on the radio continued its whispered warnings. You can't outrun him. You can't escape. As dawn began to break and the fog started to lift, the figure finally faded away, disappearing like smoke in the morning light. Nate pulled into the first truck stop he found and sat in his cab for a long time, hands shaking as he tried to process what had happened. He never saw the figure again, but he never forgot it either. And sometimes, late at night, on lonely stretches of highway, he would hear that whispered voice on his radio, warning other drivers to turn back while they still could. Some things, Nate learned, are better left in the darkness where they belong. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Eddie Malone had been hauling freight across the southwestern deserts for most of his adult life, and he thought he knew every mile of Interstate 40 from Barstow to Albuquerque. The desert had its own rhythm, its own personality that changed with the seasons and the time of day. During the brutal summer heat, it was a furnace that could kill the unprepared. In winter, it was deceptively cold, with temperatures that could drop below freezing as soon as the sun went down. But it was the desert at night that Eddie knew best. The vast emptiness under a canopy of stars. The way the headlights carved a tunnel of light through the absolute darkness. The feeling of being completely alone in a landscape that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. It was peaceful in a way that most people would never understand. A meditation broken only by the steady rumble of diesel engines and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Tonight felt different, though. Eddie had been driving for 6 hours since leaving Phoenix, and something about the darkness seemed more oppressive than usual. The stars were brilliant overhead, but they felt cold, and distant, offering no comfort against the vast emptiness surrounding his 18-wheeler. He was somewhere west of Flagstaff when he first noticed the lights in his rearview mirror. They appeared suddenly, two bright orbs that seemed too high and too wide apart to belong to any normal vehicle. Eddie squinted at his mirrors, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the lights defied easy explanation. As he watched, the lights began to close the distance between them and his truck. Eddie glanced at his speedometer. He was doing 75 miles per hour, about as fast as was safe on this stretch of highway. Whatever was behind him would have to be moving considerably faster to catch up so quickly. But then the lights simply vanished, as if someone had thrown a switch. Eddie blinked and looked again, but his mirrors showed only the red glow of his own taillights fading into the darkness behind him. He shook his head, attributing the sighting to fatigue and the hypnotic effect of staring at the same stretch of road for hours on end. A few miles later, the lights reappeared, but this time they were in front of him. Two brilliant orbs hovering just above the highway, close enough that Eddie had to slow down to avoid driving directly beneath them. They pulsed gently, like a heartbeat made of light, and seemed to be waiting for something. Eddie reached for his CB radio, intending to ask if any other drivers were seeing what he was seeing. But before he could key the microphone, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Big rig Eddie," the voice said, though Eddie was certain he had never given his name or handle over the radio that night. The voice was distorted, as if it were being transmitted from a great distance. But there was something familiar about it that he couldn't quite place. "Yeah, this is Eddie," he responded, his voice slightly shaky. "Who is this? How do you know my name? You see them, don't you?" The voice continued, ignoring his questions. "The lights, they've been waiting for you." A chill ran down Eddie's spine. He looked up at the lights hovering above the highway ahead of him. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with the words coming from his radio. "Waiting for me?" Eddie asked. "What do you mean?" "Pull over, Eddie. They want to talk to you." Eddie's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to keep driving, to get as far away from this place as possible. But there was something about the voice, something almost hypnotic, that made him want to comply. "I don't think so," Eddie said, pressing down on the accelerator. His truck surged forward, and he drove directly beneath the hovering lights. For a moment, the cab was filled with brilliant illumination, so bright that he had to squint to see the road ahead. Then he was past them, and the lights were behind him again, but not for long. As Eddie glanced in his side mirror, he saw the lights moving alongside his truck, keeping pace with him effortlessly. No matter how fast he drove, they stayed with him, two unwavering points of light in the darkness. "You can't outrun them, Eddie," the voice on the radio said. "They've chosen you. Pull over and accept what's meant to be." Eddie grabbed the microphone and keyed it angrily. "I don't know who you are or what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not stopping. Find someone else to mess with." He switched off the CB radio, but he could still hear the voice, fainter now, but persistent, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lights continued to pace his truck, sometimes moving ahead, sometimes falling behind, but never disappearing entirely. As the miles rolled by, Eddie's unease grew into genuine fear. The lights weren't behaving like any aircraft he'd ever seen, and their ability to match his speed so precisely suggested something beyond normal technology. The voice continued its patient entreaties, growing stronger whenever he passed certain landmarks, as if there were specific locations where the signal was clearer. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished again. Eddie drove on through the darkness, checking his mirrors constantly, but they didn't return. The voice faded away as well, leaving only the familiar sounds of his truck and the highway. Eddie thought he had escaped whatever strangeness had pursued him through the desert night. But as he crested a low hill, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the highway ahead. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a uniform or coveralls. He stood perfectly still, not moving as Eddie's truck bore down on him. Eddie hit the brakes, his truck skidding as he fought to bring it to a stop. The air brakes hissed and the tires screamed against the asphalt, but he managed to stop just a few feet from the figure. The man stepped forward into the glow of Eddie's headlights. His face was gaunt and pale, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. When he spoke, it was with the same voice that had been coming from the radio. "You should have listened, Eddie," the figure said. "You should have stopped when they asked nicely." Eddie threw the truck into reverse, but the engine died. He turned the key desperately, but nothing happened. The electrical systems were dead, leaving him sitting in darkness, except for the pale light emanating from the figure standing before his truck. "Don't be afraid," the figure said, walking closer. "They just want to understand. They've been watching your kind for so long, trying to comprehend what drives you to spend your lives moving constantly from one place to another, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home." Eddie found his voice. "What are you? What do you want?" "I was like you once," the figure replied. "A traveler, always moving, always searching for something I could never name. They helped me understand that the journey is more important than the destination. Now I help them find others who might be ready to learn the same lesson." The lights returned then, descending from the sky to hover around Eddie's truck. Up close, he could see that they weren't mechanical at all, but something organic, pulsing with a life of their own. As they drew nearer, Eddie felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. Maybe the figure was right. Maybe he had been searching for something all his life without knowing what it was. The endless highways, the constant motion, the inability to stay in one place for more than a few days. Perhaps it had all been leading to this moment. When the sun rose the next morning, Eddie's truck was found abandoned on I-40, its engine cold and its doors standing open. There was no sign of Eddie Malone, and no explanation for what had happened to him. But sometimes, late at night, on the desert highways, other truckers report seeing strange lights and hearing a voice on their CB radios, asking them to pull over and join the eternal journey through the stars. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Jake Thompson had always been careful about picking up hitchhikers. It wasn't that he was unsympathetic to people in need, and not everyone standing by the roadside with their thumb out had good intentions. But the woman he saw on Route 66 that night looked genuinely desperate. She was soaked to the skin, her clothes clinging to her thin frame, and her dark hair hung limp around her pale face. She waved frantically as his headlights illuminated her, and something about her expression, a mixture of fear and hope, made Jake pull over against his better judgment. "Need a ride?" he called out through his open window. The woman hurried to the passenger side of his cab, and as she climbed in, Jake noticed that she was shivering despite the warm Arizona night. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky with relief. "I thought I'd be stuck out there all night. My car broke down about 5 miles back, and I've been walking for hours." Jake pulled back onto the highway, glancing at his passenger in the dim light from his dashboard. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with delicate features and eyes that seemed much older than her years. There was something unsettling about the way she held herself, rigid and alert, as if she were listening for something in the darkness outside. "What's your name?" Jake asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "Emily," she replied, still staring out the window. "I just need to get to the next town. There's a diner there where I can call for help." They drove in silence for several miles, the only sound the steady hum of the diesel engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Jake found himself stealing glances at Emily, trying to figure out what was bothering him about her. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, never relaxing or settling back into the seat. That's when his CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker, anyone hear me?" The voice was urgent, almost panicked. Jake reached for the microphone. "This is Big Rig Jake. What's your 20? "Jake, listen to me," the voice continued. "You need to be careful. There's something you need to know about the hitchhiker." Jake's blood ran cold. He glanced at Emily, but she was still staring out the window, apparently paying no attention to the radio conversation. "What about the hitchhiker?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "She's not what she seems," the voice warned. "She's been seen before, always in the same area, always with the same story. Drivers pick her up, and then things go wrong." Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What kind of things? But before the voice could answer, Emily turned to look at him. Her eyes reflected the light from the dashboard in a way that seemed unnatural, almost luminous in the darkness. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, her voice different now, colder, with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Just another driver," Jake replied, trying to sound casual. "CB chatter, you know." Emily smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't like people talking about me behind my back." The radio crackled again. "Jake, are you still there? You need to get away from her. She's dangerous." Jake's heart was pounding now. Every instinct told him to pull over and make Emily get out, but something about her presence in the cab made him feel paralyzed, unable to act on his own behalf. "I said, turn it off," Emily repeated. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily settled back in her seat, apparently satisfied, but Jake could feel her watching him with those unnaturally bright eyes. "You're not really stranded, are you?" Jake asked, surprised by his own boldness. Emily laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but I am stranded, Jake. I've been stranded for a very long time, longer than you might imagine. What do you want?" "I want what everyone wants," Emily said. "I want to go home, but I can't do it alone. I need someone to take me there, someone who understands the roads as well as you do." Jake's mouth was dry. "Where is home?" Emily pointed ahead into the darkness beyond his headlights. "Just keep driving, Jake. You'll know when we get there." For the next hour, they drove through the desert night. Emily sat silent beside him, occasionally giving directions. "Turn here, keep straight there," leading him off the main highway and onto smaller roads that Jake didn't recognize. The landscape around them grew more desolate, more alien, as if they were driving not just through space, but through time itself. Finally, Emily told him to stop. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrub brush and rock formations that looked like sleeping giants in the starlight. There was no diner, no town, nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon. "This is it," Emily said, opening her door. "This is home." Jake looked around in confusion. "There's nothing here." Emily stepped out of the cab and turned back to look at him. In the pale light of the stars, he could see that she was changing. All the drivers who understood that sometimes You have to go off the beaten path to find where you really belong. Jake tried to start his truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again, panic rising in his throat, but nothing happened. All wearing the clothes of different eras, all with the same hollow, desperate eyes that Emily had shown him. Truckers, travelers, wanderers, who had been lured off the highway by a hitchhiker who offered them the one thing they had been searching for all their lives, a place to finally stop moving. There was no sign of Jake Thompson, and no explanation for how his truck had ended up so far from any established road. But truckers still report seeing Emily on Route 66, always in the same area, always with the same story about her broken down car. And sometimes, late at night, they say you can hear the voices of all the drivers she has collected over the years, calling out warnings on the CB radio to anyone who might be tempted to stop and offer help to a stranger in the darkness. The desert keeps its secrets, and Emily keeps her drivers, forever traveling roads that exist somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Tom Carter had always been proud of his reputation as a steady, reliable driver. In 18 years of hauling freight across the country, he had never missed a delivery deadline, never had a serious accident, and never let the loneliness and isolation of the job get to him the way it did some drivers. But the night he encountered the shadow on Highway 40 changed everything. It started with the headlights in his rear-view mirror. Tom was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, taking the night shift to avoid the heavy traffic that clogged the interstates during the day. It was just past midnight when he noticed the car behind him, driving aggressively and staying much too close to his trailer. The vehicle was a dark sedan, sleek and modern, but something about it seemed wrong. It weaved back and forth across the lanes, sometimes falling back, sometimes surging forward to tailgate his truck. When the sedan finally pulled alongside his cab, Tom rolled down his window and tried to make contact, but the driver didn't acknowledge him. Instead, the car suddenly accelerated and shot ahead, disappearing into the darkness beyond his headlights. A few minutes later, Tom saw the sedan again, this time pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. A young man stood beside it, waving frantically at the approaching truck. Despite his usual caution about roadside encounters, something about the man's obvious distress made Tom pull over. The young man ran to Tom's cab, his face pale with fear. "Please, you have to help me," he gasped. "They're coming for me. I don't have much time." Before Tom could ask who was coming, headlights appeared in the distance, approaching fast. The young man's eyes widened in terror. "That's them," he said. "Don't let them catch us." Against his better judgment, Tom unlocked his passenger door. The young man jumped in just as the pursuing vehicle roared past. Tom pulled back onto the highway, his 18-wheeler gradually building speed. In his mirrors, he could see the SUV making a U-turn, its headlights sweeping across the desert landscape as it began pursuit. "What's this about?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Who are those people?" "I don't know," the young man replied. "I think they're after something they think I have, but I don't know what it is. I've been running for 2 days." The SUV was gaining on them now, its powerful engine easily matching the pace of Tom's heavily loaded truck. As it drew closer, Tom could see that there were at least 2 people inside, their faces hidden in shadow. For the next 20 minutes, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse on the dark highway. The SUV would surge forward, trying to force Tom's truck off the road, then fall back when oncoming traffic appeared. Tom used every trick he knew, taking advantage of his truck's mass and his knowledge of the road to stay ahead of his pursuers. But the chase couldn't last forever. As they crested a hill, Tom saw a roadblock ahead. Several vehicles parked across both lanes of the highway, their headlights creating a wall of blinding light. There was nowhere to go but into the desert. Tom yanked the wheel hard to the right, his truck leaving the pavement and bouncing violently across the rocky terrain. The young man was thrown against the passenger door, crying out in pain as the cab bucked and swayed. "Hold on," Tom shouted, fighting to maintain control as his truck plowed through sagebrush and scattered rocks. Behind them, the SUV had followed them off the road, its headlights dancing wildly as it pursued them across the uneven ground. They had gone perhaps a mile into the desert when Tom's truck hit a hidden wash, a dry creek bed that sent the big rig airborne for a terrifying moment before it crashed down, the front axle snapping with a sound like a gunshot. The truck ground to a halt, steam rising from the radiator, the engine making horrible grinding noises before it finally died. "We have to run," the young man said, already reaching for the door handle. But it was too late. The SUV had caught up to them, and now Tom could see their pursuers clearly for the first time. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces covered by masks, and they moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit. "Stay in the truck," Tom said, but the young man was already climbing out, scrambling away into the darkness. Tom watched helplessly as the figures surrounded his passenger, their movements swift and efficient. The young man's screams echoed across the desert for only a few seconds before they were cut short. Tom sat frozen in his cab, not daring to move, as the figures dragged something back to their vehicle. One of them approached Tom's truck and tapped on the window with the barrel of what looked like a rifle. Tom rolled down the window with trembling hands. "You didn't see anything here tonight?" the figure said, its voice muffled by the mask. "You had a breakdown, and you're waiting for a tow truck. That's all." Tom nodded frantically. "Yes, sir, I understand." The figure studied him for a moment longer, then walked back to the SUV. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving Tom alone in the desert with his crippled truck and the memory of what he had witnessed. When the tow truck finally arrived 3 hours later, Tom told the driver exactly what the masked figure had instructed him to say. He filed a routine breakdown report with his company and never mentioned the young man or the chase or the things he had seen in the desert. But Tom never forgot that night, and he never drove Highway 40 through that particular stretch of desert again. He took early retirement 6 months later, selling his truck and moving to a small town where the biggest excitement was the weekly farmers market. Sometimes, late at night, Tom would wake up thinking he could hear the young man's screams carried on the desert wind. He would lie there in the darkness, wondering who those people were and what they had wanted, and whether there were other drivers out there who had stumbled into the same nightmare. The desert keeps its secrets, and Tom kept his silence. But he never stopped watching the news, looking for stories about missing persons and unexplained disappearances along the lonely highways of the American Southwest. Some loads, he learned, are too dangerous to carry. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Nate Tucker had been driving trucks for almost 20 years, and he thought he had heard every type of voice that could come through ACB radio. There were the good OL boys with their thick southern drawls, the professional drivers who spoke in precise, clipped sentences, and the occasional crazy person who rambled about conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. But the voice that came through his radio on that foggy night in Nevada was unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was hollow and distant, as if it were being transmitted from somewhere far beyond the normal range of CB equipment. Nate was hauling a load of machinery from Reno to Salt Lake City, taking Route 50 across the high desert. The locals called it the loneliest road in America, and Nate could understand why. For hundreds of miles, there was nothing but sagebrush, rocky hills, and the occasional abandoned mining town. It was the kind of place where a breakdown could turn into a life-threatening situation if you weren't prepared. The fog had rolled in around midnight, thick and white, and so dense that Nate could barely see the yellow center line of the highway. He had slowed his 18-wheeler to a crawl, using the reflective markers along the roadside to navigate through the murky darkness. That's when his CB radio crackled to life. "Better watch out," the voice said, so faint that Nate almost missed it. "He's out there tonight." Nate grabbed his microphone and keyed it. "Breaker 19, this is Nate. Who's out there?" No response, just static and the occasional pop of atmospheric interference. Nate shrugged and set the mic down, figuring it was just some driver trying to spook the rookies with ghost stories. But a few miles later, the voice came back, clearer this time, but still carrying that strange, hollow quality. "You should have listened the first time," it said. "Now, it's too late." A chill ran down Nate's spine. He keyed the microphone again, his voice slightly shaky. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not in the mood for jokes. If you've got something to say it plain." This time, there was a response, but not the one Nate expected. "I tried to warn you," the voice said sadly, "just like I tried to warn the others. But nobody ever listens until it's too late." Nate's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Warn me about what? What others?" But the radio had gone silent again, leaving only the steady hiss of static and the sound of his diesel engine struggling through the thick fog. As Nate continued down the highway, he began to see shapes in the mist. At first, he thought they were just tricks of the light, shadows cast by his headlights bouncing off the fog. But as he looked more carefully, he realized that some of the shapes had a distinctly human appearance. They stood along the roadside, just visible at the edge of his vision, perfectly still and watching his truck pass. Nate counted at least a dozen of them, all wearing what looked like the clothes of different time periods. Some were dressed like modern truckers, but others wore the kind of work clothes he associated with the 1950s and 60s. "What the hell?" Nate muttered, leaning forward to peer through his windshield. But every time he tried to focus on one of the figures, it would fade back into the fog, leaving him uncertain whether he had really seen anything at all. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was joined by others, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all around him. "Join us," they said in unison. "Stay with us. The road goes on forever here." Nate's heart was pounding now. He pressed down on the accelerator, trying to push his truck faster through the fog. But the mist seemed to be getting thicker, not thinner. His headlights could barely penetrate more than a few feet ahead, and the figures along the roadside were becoming more numerous, more distinct. "Who are you?" Nate called out through his open window, though he wasn't sure why he expected an answer. The voices on the radio responded as one. "We are the drivers who came before you. We are the ones who got lost in the fog and never found our way out." Nate's blood ran cold. He grabbed his CB microphone and tried to raise someone, anyone, on the emergency channel. Mayday, Mayday, this is Nate Tucker on Route 50. I need help. Something's wrong out here. But the only response was laughter. Dozens of voices laughing in harmony, the sound echoing through his cab as if it were coming from inside his own head. Then, through the fog ahead, Nate saw a light. It was warm and welcoming, like the glow from a roadside diner or truck stop. As he drew closer, he could make out the shape of a building, its neon sign flickering through the mist. Rest here, the voices urged. You're tired. You need to stop and rest. Every rational part of Nate's mind told him to keep driving, to push through the fog and get back to the safety of the main highway. But he was exhausted, and the light ahead looked so inviting. What harm could there be in stopping for just a few minutes? As he pulled into the parking lot of what appeared to be an abandoned truck stop, Nate could see other vehicles already parked there. Old trucks, some of them models he hadn't seen on the road in decades, their chrome bumpers and running lights gleaming in the otherworldly light. Nate parked his rig and climbed down from the cab. The air was thick and cold, and the fog swirled around him like living things. As he walked toward the building, he could see figures moving inside, their shadows dancing against the windows. The door opened before he could reach for the handle, and a man stepped out. He was wearing a trucker's jacket and cap, but his clothes looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1960s. "Welcome," the man said, his voice the same hollow tone Nate had been hearing on the radio. "We've been waiting for you." Nate tried to back away, but his feet felt heavy, as if they were stuck in thick mud. More figures emerged from the building, all of them dressed like truckers from different eras, all of them smiling with the same empty expression. "The road ends here," one of them said, "but don't worry, you'll like it. We all like it here." As the fog closed in around him, Nate felt a strange sense of peace settling over his mind. The voices were right. He was tired. He had been driving for so long, moving from one place to another, without ever really arriving anywhere. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to rest. When the sun rose the next morning, the fog lifted from Route 50, revealing nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon. Nate Tucker's truck was never found, and there was no trace of the building he had seen in the mist. But sometimes, on foggy nights, drivers report hearing voices on their CB radios, welcoming them to stop and rest at a truck stop that exists somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. The loneliest road in America has its own hospitality and its own way of making sure that no driver ever has to be alone again. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Mike Thompson had always been proud of his ability to spot trouble on the road before it could become dangerous. 23 years of long-haul trucking had given him an almost supernatural awareness of the traffic patterns around him. The ability to predict when a car was about to make a sudden lane change, or when weather conditions were about to turn nasty. But the phantom truck that began following him on Interstate 80 through Wyoming was something beyond his experience, something that defied every rule of physics and common sense he had learned in more than 2 decades behind the wheel. It started just after midnight, as Mike was hauling a load of steel beams from Denver to Seattle. The highway was virtually empty, just his 18-wheeler and the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. The night was clear and cold, with a canopy of stars stretched across the big sky that gave Wyoming its nickname. Mike was listening to late-night talk radio, half-asleep discussions about UFOs and government conspiracies that helped pass the time during the long, monotonous stretches of Highway E. He was reaching for his coffee thermos when he noticed the headlights in his rearview mirror. The truck behind him was maintaining a steady distance, maybe a quarter-mile back, but something about it struck Mike as odd. The headlights were wrong somehow, too bright, too white, and positioned in a way that didn't match any truck model he was familiar with. Mike had been passed by plenty of drivers over the years, and he had done his share of passing as well. There was an etiquette to it, a set of unspoken rules about how you signaled your intentions and how you maintained safe distances. But the truck behind him wasn't following any of those rules. It stayed exactly the same distance behind him for mile after mile, neither gaining nor falling back, as if it were connected to his truck by an invisible chain. Mike tried slowing down to let it pass, but the other truck slowed down as well. He tried speeding up, pushing his rig harder than was safe on the dark highway. But the phantom truck matched his speed perfectly. Mike grabbed his CB radio and tried to make contact. "Breaker 19, this is Big Mike. Driver behind me. What's your 20? Static answered him. Then a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Right behind you, Mike," the voice said. "Right where I've always been." A chill ran down Mike's spine. He hadn't given his name or his handle over the radio, but somehow the other driver knew who he was. "How do you know my name?" Mike asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know everything about you, Mike," the voice replied. "I know about the load you're carrying. I know where you're going. I know where you've been." Mike glanced nervously in his rearview mirror. The truck was still there, its headlights burning like stars in the darkness. But now he could see more details in the glow of his taillights. The truck looked old, much older than anything that should have been on the road. Its chrome was tarnished and dented, and its paint was faded and peeling. "What do you want?" Mike asked into the radio. "I want you to remember," the voice said. "I want you to remember what happened on this stretch of road 15 years ago." Mike's blood ran cold. 15 years ago, he had been driving this same route when he had encountered another trucker who had been having mechanical problems. The man had flagged Mike down, asking for help with a blown tire. Mike had been running late on a delivery, and he had made a decision that had haunted him ever since. "I'm sorry," Mike whispered into the microphone. "I should have stopped. I should have helped you. You left me there," the voice said, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. "You left me alone on the side of the road in the middle of winter. I froze to death waiting for someone else to stop." Mike remembered reading about it in the newspaper a few days later. A trucker named Robert Hayes had been found dead beside his disabled rig, apparently having died of exposure during a sudden blizzard. The article had mentioned that several drivers had passed the scene without stopping, and Mike had known that he was one of them. "I'm sorry, Robert," Mike said, tears streaming down his face. "I was young and stupid. I thought someone else would help you, but no one else did." Robert's voice replied, "Just like no one helped the others. The drivers you've passed over the years when they needed help. The hitchhikers you've ignored. The accidents you've driven past without stopping to see if anyone needed assistance." Mike's hands were shaking on the steering wheel as the memories came flooding back. There had been others, more than he wanted to admit. Times when he had chosen his schedule over his conscience, his profit over his humanity. "What do you want from me?" Mike asked. "I want you to stop," Robert's voice said. "I want you to stop running from what you've done." In his mirror, Mike could see the phantom truck drawing closer. Its headlights were so bright now that they seemed to fill his entire cab with white light. He could hear the sound of its engine, a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can't outrun the past, Mike," Robert said. "You can't outrun what you've done to people." Mike pressed down on the accelerator, pushing his truck to its limit, but the phantom truck stayed with him. No matter how fast he went, it remained exactly the same distance behind him, its headlights boring into his soul like the eyes of judgment. As dawn began to break over the Wyoming landscape, the phantom truck finally began to fade. Its headlights grew dimmer, its engine noise quieter, until it was nothing more than a memory and a lingering sense of guilt. Mike pulled into the first truck stop he found and sat in his cab for a long time, thinking about Robert Hayes and all the other people he had failed to help over the years. When he finally climbed down from his truck, he walked into the diner and asked the waitress if she knew of anyone in the area who might need assistance. It was a small gesture, but it was a start, and sometimes, late at night, on lonely stretches of highway, Mike would keep his CB radio tuned to the emergency channel, listening for drivers who might need help and making sure that no one else would have to die alone beside the road. The phantom truck never appeared again, but Mike never forgot the lesson it had taught him. Some debts can only be paid forward, and redemption sometimes comes in the form of a second chance to do the right thing. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Jack Reynolds had been driving the same route for 15 years, Interstate 15 from Los Angeles to Las Vegas and back again, hauling everything from electronics to produce to building materials. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every place where the highway patrol liked to set up speed traps. It was a routine that had become as familiar as breathing, a meditation of diesel engines and desert landscapes. But the night he picked up the mysterious passenger near Barstow, that familiar routine became something far more sinister. She was standing beside a broken-down sedan on the shoulder of the highway, a young woman in a white dress that seemed to glow in his headlights. Jack had a policy about hitchhikers. He didn't pick them up. Too many risks, too many variables. But something about this woman's obvious distress made him pull over despite his better judgment. "Car trouble," he called out through his open window. The woman hurried to his truck, her face pale and frightened. "Please, I need help. My car just died, and my phone has no signal out here." Jack hesitated, then unlocked his passenger door. "Where are you heading?" "Vegas," she said, climbing into the cab. "I have to be there by morning. It's important." As they pulled back onto the highway, Jack studied his passenger in the dim light from his dashboard. She was probably in her 20s, with long dark hair and eyes that seemed much older than her years. There was something unsettling about the way she held herself, as if she were listening for something in the darkness outside. "What's your name?" Jack asked, trying to make conversation. "Sarah," she replied, though she didn't ask for his name in return. "Thank you for stopping." Most people don't anymore. They drove in silence for several miles, the lights of Barstow fading behind them and the neon glow of Las Vegas still hours ahead. Jack found himself stealing glances at Sarah, trying to figure out what was bothering him about her. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead as if she could see something in the darkness that he couldn't. That's when his CB radio crackled to life. "Attention all drivers on I-15, a voice said, urgent and crackling with static. "Be on the lookout for a woman in a white dress. Do not pick her up. Repeat, do not pick her up." Jack's blood ran cold. He glanced at Sarah, but she was still staring straight ahead, apparently paying no attention to the radio. "She's dangerous," the voice continued. "She's been seen before, always in the same area, always with the same story. Drivers who pick her up are never seen again." Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Sarah," he said carefully, "did you hear that?" Sarah turned to look at him, and for a moment Jack thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, something that wasn't quite human. "Hear what?" she asked innocently. The radio crackled again, a different voice this time. "She's not what she seems," it warned. "She's been dead for 20 years, killed in a car accident, right where you picked her up. She keeps trying to get home, but she never makes it, and neither do the drivers who help her." Sarah's expression began to change. The innocent, frightened look melted away, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Turn off the radio, Jack," she said, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality. Jack's hand moved toward the radio almost involuntarily, but he fought against the compulsion. "What are you?" he asked. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm someone who needs to get home," she said, "and you're going to take me there, whether you want to or not." The temperature in the cab began to drop, and Jack could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Sarah's form began to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent, and Jack could see the desert landscape through her body. "I've been trying to get home for so long," Sarah said, her voice now sounding like wind through dry leaves. "But every time I get close, something goes wrong. The drivers always panic, always try to get away. But you're different, Jack. You're going to take me all the way home." Jack pressed down on the accelerator, his truck picking up speed, as he tried to outrun the supernatural passenger beside him. But Sarah just laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You can't get away from me," she said. "I'm part of your truck now, part of your journey. We're going to be together forever." The speedometer climbed higher, 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. Jack's truck was moving faster than it had ever moved before, faster than should have been possible with a full load. The desert landscape blurred past his windows, and the stars overhead began to streak across the sky like meteors. "Where are we going?" Jack shouted over the roar of the wind. "Home," Sarah replied, "to the place where all journeys end." Jack looked at his gauges and realized with growing horror that his fuel needle was stuck on full, even though he should have used half a tank by now. His odometer had stopped working, frozen at the same number it had shown when he first picked up Sarah. Time itself seemed to have become unstuck, trapping him in an eternal moment on the highway. Hours passed, or maybe days. Jack couldn't tell anymore. The sun never rose, the stars never moved, and the road stretched on endlessly ahead of him. His CB radio continued to crackle with warnings from other drivers, voices calling out to him from what seemed like another world. "Jack, if you can hear this, you need to get away from her," one voice pleaded. "She's taken other drivers. They're all trapped with her now, driving the same stretch of road forever." Jack began to see them then, other trucks on the highway, their headlights glowing in the eternal night. As they passed, he could see the drivers inside, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with the knowledge of what had happened to them. They were all prisoners of the road now, all part of Sarah's eternal journey home. "This is what I needed," Sarah said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Not just one driver, but all of them. A convoy of souls to keep me company on the way home." Jack tried to turn off the highway, to find an exit that would take him away from this supernatural trap. But every off-ramp led back to the same endless stretch of I-15. There was no escape, no way out of the loop that Sarah had created. As the eternal night wore on, Jack began to understand the truth. Sarah wasn't trying to get home. She was home. The highway was her domain, her eternal resting place, and she collected drivers to keep her company in her loneliness. Other truckers still report seeing the phantom convoy on I-15, a line of trucks with ghostly headlights that appear and disappear in the desert night. They say if you listen carefully to your CB radio on that stretch of highway, you can hear the voices of the trapped drivers, calling out warnings to anyone who might be tempted to stop for a hitchhiker in a white dress. The road between Los Angeles and Las Vegas has its own passenger now, and she's always looking for company on the journey that never ends. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Tom Harris had been driving trucks for 25 years, and he thought he had seen every type of strangeness the highway could offer. He'd encountered everything from drunk drivers to severe weather to mechanical failures that defied explanation. But nothing had prepared him for his final run down Highway 95 through the Nevada desert. It was supposed to be a routine haul computer equipment from Reno to Phoenix, a route he'd driven dozens of times before. The pay was good, the schedule was reasonable, and Tom was looking forward to getting home to his wife and kids in time for his daughter's birthday party. The trouble started just after midnight as Tom was crossing the state line into Nevada. His CB radio, which had been quiet for most of the evening, suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static. "Attention drivers on Highway 95, a voice said, urgent and filled with static. There's been reports of a dangerous hitchhiker in the area. Do not stop for anyone. Repeat, do not stop." Tom frowned and picked up his microphone. "This is Big Tom on 95 southbound. What kind of dangerous hitchhiker?" But there was no response, just the steady hiss of static. Tom shrugged and set the mic down, figuring it was just another trucker trying to spook the newcomers with ghost stories. An hour later, Tom saw her, a woman in a flowing white dress, standing by the side of the road, her arm outstretched in the universal gesture for help. She looked young and frightened, and every instinct Tom had developed as a father told him to stop and help. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. "Need a ride?" he called out through his open window. The woman hurried to his truck, relief evident on her face. "Oh, thank you," she said. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down about 10 miles back." As she climbed into his cab, Tom noticed that she seemed unusually cold despite the warm desert night. She was shivering, and her breath misted slightly in the air. "What's your name?" Tom asked as he pulled back onto the highway. "Anna," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself. "I'm trying to get to Las Vegas. I have family there." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, Tom occasionally glancing at his passenger to make sure she was all right. Anna sat quietly, looking out at the desert landscape, and Tom found her presence oddly soothing. That's when his CB radio came to life again. "Tom," a voice said, and he was startled to hear his own name. "Tom, you need to listen to me very carefully." Tom grabbed his microphone. "This is Tom. Who is this? How do you know my name?" "I'm trying to warn you," the voice continued. "The woman in your truck isn't what she seems. She's been dead for 15 years, killed in a car accident on this same stretch of highway." Tom glanced at Anna, but she was still staring out the window, apparently unaware of the radio conversation. "That's impossible," Tom said into the microphone. "She's sitting right here next to me. Look at her closely," the voice urged. "Really look at her." Tom turned to study Anna more carefully. In the dim light from his dashboard, he could see that her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her clothes, which had looked like a white dress from a distance, were actually a hospital gown, stained with something dark. "She's trying to get home," the voice on the radio continued. "But every time she gets close, something happens to the driver who picks her up. They disappear, Tom. They're never seen again." Anna finally turned to look at him, and Tom saw that her eyes were completely black, like pools of oil reflecting nothing. "Don't listen to them," Anna said, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "They're trying to keep us apart. But we belong together now, Tom. We're going to take a journey together." Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the temperature in the cab dropped even further. He could see his breath now, and frost was beginning to form on the inside of his windshield. "Let me out," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll pull over, and you can get out." Anna laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "I can't get out, Tom, and neither can you. We're together now, for better or worse." The truck's engine began to make strange noises, grinding and whining, as if it were being pushed beyond its limits. Tom looked at his speedometer and saw that they were doing over 100 miles per hour, faster than his loaded truck should have been able to go. "Where are we going?" Tom asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Home," Anna replied. "To the place where all journeys end. To the place where I've been waiting for so long." Tom tried to apply the brakes, but the pedal went to the floor without slowing the truck at all. He tried to steer toward the shoulder, but the wheel wouldn't respond to his input. The truck continued its relentless pace down the dark highway, carrying them toward some destination that existed beyond the normal world. Through his CB radio, Tom could hear other voices now, the voices of drivers who had made the same mistake he had, who had stopped to help a hitchhiker who wasn't really there. "Welcome to the convoy," one voice said sadly. "We've all been waiting for you." As the eternal night stretched on before them, Tom began to understand that his driving days were over. He was part of something larger now, something that existed in the spaces between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. His wife would wonder why he never came home. His daughter would have her birthday party without him, but Tom would be driving forever now, carrying passengers who could never reach their destinations on highways that existed only in the realm of the lost. The last thing Tom remembered from his old life was the sound of his CB radio, crackling with the voices of other drivers, warning about a dangerous hitchhiker on Highway 95. And then he was adding his own voice to the chorus, trying to warn the next driver who might be tempted to stop and help a woman in white standing by the side of the road. Some journeys never end, and some passengers never reach their destinations. But the highway always has room for one more truck in its phantom convoy, and there's always another driver willing to stop and help a stranger in need. The road goes on forever, and the night never ends.